Welcome to the Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. We're here to share stories of real river accidents and rescues and find expert advice on how to solve the problems you might encounter in the Whitewater River environment. I'm your host, Jack Diddy, an emergency medicine physician, whitewater paddler, and wilderness medicine educator. Together, I hope we can celebrate successful rescues and learn from our mistakes in a supportive environment. If you have a story to share of a non-fatal accident or rescue, send me an email at thesafetybreak@gmail.com or contact me on our Facebook page, The Safety Break. If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button and follow us on social media. I hope you learned something valuable in the show.
So I had a depressed skull fracture, depressed into the frontal sinus. I had a horrible concussion. It was like the concussion to end all concussions. I had bilateral pulmonary contusions, which is bruising in the lungs. They're really severe. I broke my back in, I think, 4 places in the L spine, and the L4 fracture was particularly bad. I had a fracture dislocation of the left distal radius. Had some finger dislocations. I had a bad fracture of the right proximal radius, left fibula, and then a really terrible, it's called a pilon fracture. It's a fairly common climbing injury, and it's a fracture of the ankle. It's essentially the ankle shatters. Both arms, both legs, my skull, my back.
On December 14th, I received one of those dreaded text messages. Did you hear what happened to Adam? These messages are all too common in the whitewater world. They often take your breath away, and you get that gut punch sensation that you feel with sudden bad news. This one was a little different though. There was no river accident. After a flurry of phone calls, I found out that my friend Adam Herzog had fallen 50 feet in an accident at a climbing gym. Roughly half of the people who fall vertically from this height don't survive. Adam was in the ICU, on a ventilator, with potentially life-threatening injuries. And of course, after trying to get the details of his condition, the next obvious question was what happened. Well, incredibly, Adam was climbing at the gym and failed to clip into an auto belay device. So at the top of the route, he leaned back to descend, and instead of the gentle lower on the rope, he fell directly to the floor. There was no gear malfunction, no miscalculation of a move, and no one to blame but himself. He just neglected to clip in. Luckily, Adam survived, but with some life-changing injuries. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with a whitewater rescue podcast? First of all, if you've been around the southeastern U.S. whitewater scene, and particularly the whitewater racing scene in the last 2 decades, you probably know of Adam Herzog, or maybe you've trailed behind him in a race. He's a friend of many in the paddling community, so I thought some of our listeners would like to hear his story directly from him. Secondly, Adam has made a remarkable comeback from his injury in just a few short months. And I think there are some lessons in the story of his accident and his recovery that apply well to whitewater paddlers. Now, before we go any further, and before you judge Adam for such a ridiculous mistake, I need you to understand what kind of an outdoor athlete this guy is. Adam has been paddling Class 5 whitewater for about 25 years. He's raced the Green River Narrows for 20 of those years and keeps getting faster. He's a multiple-time winner of Jerry's Battle, a combined Class 5 river race and road bike race. He's an ultra-endurance athlete with a 100-mile trail race under his belt. This past summer, at the age of 43, Adam paddled the legendary Stikine River in British Columbia, one of the most intimidating Class 5 river trips in the world. He's also a longtime paramedic educator, a nurse on the trauma team at Mission Hospital. He's a dad and husband, raising 2 very cool kids who are already tearing it up on the river. Basically, if you ask me who is one of the most overall badass outdoor athletes in the eastern U.S., Adam's name immediately comes to mind. The exact opposite of someone you'd associate with complacency or reckless behavior. So it's quite ironic that this error almost killed him. In this episode, Adam's going to tell us about the high highs and the low lows of the past year. We're going to hear about his preparation for the Stikine, the climbing accident, and his remarkable recovery. I sat down and spoke with him in late April, about 4 months after the accident occurred. So, welcome, Adam.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about who you are, paddling experience, occupation, whatever you think is important.
I am a trauma nurse in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a lifelong kayaker. I've been kayaking for over 30 years. I'm 43 years old. I started paddling when I was 11 or 12. I'm a dad. I got two boys, Hudson and Rylan. They're 8 and 12, and I'm married to an incredible partner, badass ultramarathoner, climber, mom, and neurologist. Spent the majority of my life in the Asheville area or within an hour of Asheville, except for about 5 years up in New England.
So you're 43 years old and you decide to run the Stikine for the first time. What was your thought process behind the preparation for that? I mean, that's a huge undertaking for most people in the paddling world. It's a big deal, and it's especially a big deal when you have children at home, you have a family. So what did you do to prepare for that?
Well, it was really a 5-year process. I mean, like many Class 5 boaters, I had thought about the Stikine for decades. I first heard about it, I was probably 13 years old or something. So I had mulled over it for many, many years, but I didn't get serious about it until about the last 5 years. And so for me, that process involved a combination of mental and physical preparation. So on the mental side, it was forcing myself into situations that are uncomfortable and situations where I have had to deal with a little adversity, because I knew that going up there, I would be in a canyon where walking just wasn't an option. And so if I came upon a large rapid, kind of in the years leading up to this, that normally I would have considered walking, I would oftentimes sort of make myself do it, because I figured, that's exactly the situation I'm going to be in the Stikine. So there was that mental aspect, and that also crossed over into the like the cardio training and strength training. So if there's a steep hill in front of my house that I do hill repeats on, and if I didn't feel like doing hill repeats that day, I absolutely forced myself to do it just because I didn't want to do it. So it was sort of a 5-year process of mentally getting ready for this, with a lot of kind of guided imagery and not very mystic, but somewhat meditative approach to it. And then on the physical preparation side, there was obviously you have to go kayaking as much as you can. So I was paddling a couple hundred days a year, and it didn't really matter to me whether I was paddling on the North Fork of the Payette or on a section of the Swannanoa here in Asheville that's like 100 CFS and like shallow flat water, because I had 45 minutes while my kids were in their Taekwondo classes or something like that. So I just made sure that I was paddling a ton, and that and then I did a lot of play boating, getting the roll really dialed and bomb proof. So I actually spent a fair amount of time training for the Stikine on the Nana Hill and French Broad, on Class 2 and 3 rivers. I also did seek out as much pushy water as I can, because it's really hard to simulate true big water in the Southeast, but we have opportunities for that. You just have to condense smaller volumes of water and steeper terrain. And so the green at 200% is not true big water, but it's pushy. And you're going to flip over at times when you really need to roll up. And so all that kind of worked in tandem, the physical and mental, over the last 5 years. And then there was also things like breath work. So I got my breath hold up over 3 minutes, a static breath hold, swimming underwater at the pool, weight training, things that I didn't really start doing until I was in my late 30s, early 40s. So instead, I guess to sum it up, I just took kayaking a lot more seriously than I did when I was 25.
So for some of our listeners, they may not know what the Stikine is all about. How would you describe the river?
I would describe the Stikine as kind of the ultimate mission. It's not really the expedition that it once was in terms of, so the Stikine's in northern British Columbia. It's 60-mile long canyon. It's 1,000 foot deep. It's full of Class 5+ whitewater, big water, so 10 to 20,000 CFS, and very committed. And that's kind of the defining characteristic, is that it's probably one of the longer canyons that maintains that level of commitment for so long. And so, you're locked in there, and there's not much opportunity for rescue, if any, in spots. And there's places where you can't get out of your boat to scout things, or portaging's very limited. And it really kind of throws it all at you. There's going to be places where you have to hit large river features and flip and roll, and it's just part of it. And so you got to have your head together, and you got to have a really tight operating team. But I think at least for me, growing up in the era of whitewater that I grew up in, the Stickeen was always looked at as one of my friends said, if there's one river, it's the river. And I think that really sums it up.
So how was the Stickeen? How did it go?
The trip went off without a hitch. I had a great partner in Josh Huber, a young paddler from Alabama. And we teamed up with a really nice mix of folks. There were 6 of us on the trip. We paddled a long section of the Fraser River and some of its tributaries we spent about a week paddling together before we went to the Stickeen. We were waiting for the level to drop a little bit. And it was really nice preparation because we're doing some long, hard days, 40 to 60 miles a day on the Fraser, with lots of flat water and some world-class big water class 4 that was, for Josh and I, pretty unique in terms of the character of the whitewater. So that allowed us to all get dialed in individually, get dialed in on the team, and then we went up there and just had a great trip. I mean, it was the trip of a lifetime. As I said, 5 years of preparation, and I felt like I was right where I needed to be, both mentally and physically. And I was pretty overwhelmed when we got to the takeouts, just because I had something I had dreamed about for so long. And it was a little different. It was interesting to meet up there with Josh. As I said, he's 22. So he's kind of at the beginning of his expedition whitewater career. And I'm kind of at the end of mine, regardless of any accident. But going up there with kids, it was different for me for sure than it was for him. And it was different. I was the only one on the trip with kids. So making those phone calls, we're making that notoriously long drive up the Stuart Cassiar to the put-in was pretty gut-wrenching. It was the hardest drive I've ever done. 20 plus hours of kind of stewing and, being fatigued from the long trip on the Fraser, not sleeping much for several days. It was gut-wrenching. But once we got up there, I woke up and looked out and I said, this is it. This is the Stickeen. It's time to do it. And once we got in the water, it was all good. It was, there were some moments of stress, but for the most part, that was an enjoyable trip.
Let's hear about your accident. So you come off this high of having run the Stickeen back in August.
Yeah.
You're at the top of your game.
Right. Yeah. So I was, physically, I think probably in the best shape of my life, at least in terms of paddling and general strength. And so I would say that my climbing accident started way before I fell. It probably started in the summer leading up to the Stickeen when I really felt bulletproof. I mean, I was paddling exactly the way I wanted to, and I felt like I was doing it in a really safe as can be manner, but I was pushing. And went to the Stickeen, pulled that off, came back. It was pretty dry when I first got back, so I kind of eased off a little bit from the paddling, and then there was Green Race. But I had my best time ever at Green Race after 20 years of doing the race, and it really boosted me into the fall and early winter, and I kind of got into this pattern where we had some really good water here. The Pigeon River drives were running all fall because of a dam maintenance that was going on. So they were running at high levels, which is about as good a big water as we have around here. It's class 5, it's steep, but it's maybe 2,000 to 3,000 CFS of really pushy whitewater. So I was going there a couple days a week, and then I was going to the green at 200%, which is double the kind of normal summer flows, once or twice a week. And so I just got into this routine where I was doing really hard stuff almost every day. And I was working a few days a week, but I would typically take my kids to school, drop them off, go do something hard and scary and pick them up. It's like between 9 and 3, I could do whatever I wanted. And that was just how the fall and winter were going. And I would occasionally stop at the climbing gym on my way home from the green. So it's right on the way. And on December 14th of 2022, I was paddling on the green with my buddies, high water, got off of that, and I guess I just turned my brain off when I got off the river. Like my risk, my risk exposure for the day is essentially over, other than driving on the interstate. But as I was driving home, I realized I had time to stop at the gym for a workout, and that's kind of what I saw it as, was just an afterthought or some exercise. And so I went to the gym, and I'm doing my thing, climbing, and climbed for probably spent an hour there. And on what was going to be the last climb of the session, I was on an auto belay device, which, if any of your listeners don't know, is a rope that is tethered from the ceiling to the ground. You clip into the rope, and the rope retracts into a device as you climb. When you get to the top, you let go and you're lowered down. And incredibly, I climbed up to the top of the wall without clipping in. So I thought I was clipped in, but I was not. And when I got to the top of the 50-foot wall, I let go.
Why do you think that happened? Like, clearly wasn't a conscious choice to not clip in. You weren't trying to avoid their protocols and freestyle the wall. Yeah. So what happened there?
I would, in the American Alpine Club article, or the first cause, or the first kind of element, I wrote hubris, and that is arrogance. And I do think that somewhere, this wasn't a conscious thought, but I think deep inside the recesses of my subconscious, I probably thought, I'm the big badass class 5 kayaker, and Jim can't hurt me.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I did, and that's not something that I'm proud of, but I think it is important to be aware that we are, completely fallible, and we are just not, like, when you fall 50 feet, it doesn't matter how big and bad you are, you're going to get crushed like a bug. Yeah.
Your accent is a little out of character.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the ironies of my accent is I seriously doubt if anyone who knows me that heard I was in the ICU was surprised, but I'm sure that everybody was really surprised of what had actually gone down. The obvious problem is complacency. But when I first started going to the gym, I was pretty uncomfortable in that environment. I didn't know much about climbing. This is a couple of years ago. And so it really had me out of my comfort zone. And so when I was climbing on the auto belay initially, getting a feel for it, I was so paranoid about it that I would climb up 5 or 6 feet and then jump off to make sure that everything engaged and that it was working correctly. And, you do that auto belay device hundreds of times, and you just get so jaded to the risk. And I had even said to my wife one time, which this is embarrassing that I said this now, but I said to Linda one time, "Can't get hurt on the auto belay. It's idiot proof." Well, it turns out I'm an idiot, But I think that's probably the biggest thing in terms of relation to paddling, and kind of drawing a parallel there, is, I just didn't bring the level of respect that I typically bring to the river or the outdoor climbing arena. Like, if I was climbing outside, I was triple checking things. One time we went and I was cleaning anchors while Linda was leading, and I would clean. And I made a literal checklist and taped it to my leg, and I would get up there and go through the checklist. If I would have brought that kind of respect to the gym, this would not have happened. And I think the fact that the gym feels very contrived to someone like me who has spent a ton of time in austere environments, the gym feels safe. And it's not safe. That's one thing I've kind of learned. One of the big takeaways I've learned from this is there is no safe. An environment can be as safe or sketchy as you make it. But to assume that something is safe is a huge mistake. And, like with paddling class 5 especially, those of us that are paddling hundreds of days a year, like you get so used to the exposure that you really quickly begin to forget how serious it is. And, it's hard to maintain 100% vigilance, although it's impossible to maintain 100% vigilance. But I think at least for me, I will, in the future, I will approach things, or will try to approach whatever challenges I'm taking on with more the eyes of a newbie.
So you fell 50 feet.
Yep.
What's the next experience that you remember?
Waking up in the ICU, intubated on the ventilator 2 days later. It was horrifying. Like I said, I'm a trauma nurse, and so I deal with, we take care of trauma patients, at work every single day and provide the initial kind of resuscitation and stabilization to those folks. So I was transported from the climbing gym to the hospital, and my own team received me and
you were unconscious throughout that?
I had woken up, but I have complete amnesia. So I have retrograde amnesia from the climb, the climbing session, even back several days. I kind of remember bits and pieces of the week, but I know more about the accident from video, closed circuit video that the gym owner has. I haven't watched it, but we've talked about it pretty extensively.
What injuries did you have from this? This was an enormous injury that you had. It's really mind-boggling that you bounced back so fast. But what?
It could have been worse for sure, but I did have a lot of orthopedic stuff and some internal injuries as well. So I had a depressed skull fracture, depressed into the frontal sinus. I had a horrible concussion. It was like the concussion to end all concussions. Let's see, I had bilateral pulmonary contusions, which is bruising in the lungs. They're really severe. I broke my back in, I think, 4 places in the L spine. And the L4 fracture was particularly bad. It was neurosurgeons divide the vertebrae into 3 columns, and it was a 3-column fracture, so all the way through. I broke my left, I had a fracture dislocation of the left distal radius. Had some finger dislocations. I had a bad fracture of the right proximal radius, left fibula, and then a really terrible, it's called a pilon fracture. It's a fairly common climbing injury, and it's a fracture of the ankle. It's essentially the ankle shatters. Both arms, both legs, my skull, my back.
And how many surgeries did you have in that first week?
So they repaired the left wrist within a few days while I was still intubated in the ICU. They did that. And they put an X-Fix, which is an external fixator in my right leg. It's kind of an external brace that goes through the bone to allow for the swelling to improve before they did the definitive surgery. And then I have a partial joint replacement in my right elbow now, so I've got a titanium radial head. And then I went back to the OR a few weeks later, I guess maybe 10, 12 days later, for the definitive repair of the open reduction, internal fixation of the right ankle. So 4 surgeries total.
And how far out are you from the injury now? So this is April 27th. The injury occurred December.
A little over 4 months.
Yeah, so 4 months into it. Okay. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, you basically came out of the hospital swinging.
Yeah. When I woke up in the ICU, when I first was like regaining my memory and actually able to have a conversation, one of my physicians is someone that I have worked with for the last several years. The trauma doctor said, I said, "What's the plan?" As I was moving out of the ICU to the floor. And he said, "Well, you're going to go sit in a nursing home for 3 months, let the bones heal, and then you can start physical therapy."
And you just called on that right away?
I mean, it lit a fire. I lit a fire under me.
Yeah.
And I remember like the day he told me that, I was moved out of the ICU and went to my floor. And I remember thinking, all right, if that's what they think is going to happen, I need to start getting to work. And so I would do 10 leg raises on each leg every hour, which doesn't sound like a big deal, right? But I was still having all this inflammatory stuff, and I had the X-Fix on my right leg, so it was super heavy. And so I was awake for probably 15 or 16 hours. So I do 10 leg lifts.
So you're doing this in the hospital?
In the bed. This is like day 3,
This is day 3.
Yeah. And that night, my quads just went into these insane spasms. And so I was like, all right, that was too much. But I do think that mentality is what got me through, that avoided that scenario of ended up in a nursing home. Because to me, that was like, this was already a nightmare, but that was going to be so much worse.
And what was it like when I think we had another conversation prior to this interview where you told me about the pain of standing up for the first time.
Yeah,
like what was that like?
Yeah, the first time they tried to get me up, I couldn't do it at all. It was pain that was, I've had broken bones before. I've broken my legs, I've broken my arm, separated my shoulder, I've had concussions. So I've had a number of isolated orthopedic injuries, and this was so far beyond anything I'd ever experienced. It completely recalibrated pain for me. Like what I would have considered to be severe pain 6 months ago, I would consider to be moderate pain now. It's just changed. It just completely moved the bar.
And what are you doing specifically to recover from this? You mentioned physical therapy, yoga. Like what are the modalities that you're using?
So it's been this long process very slow process of PT. I couldn't really do proper PT until I could bear weight. So it was a lot of arm circles and leg lifts in bed and things of that nature. I started doing that stuff as soon as I was able to make, conscious effort to do PT. I was doing it from the hospital bed. And now that's moved on to more, after about 2 months, I got my kayak for the first time, got my first flatwater strokes in. Did that for a week or so, and then moved up to class 2, and it's just been a steady increase in my paddling. I was able to start walking with a peg leg orthotic device back in February, and so I would do a few miles at a time on that thing on paths basically, and now I'm pretty functioning. I'm not going to say I'm back to normal, but I'm able to do weightlifting, working with a personal trainer and my physical therapist. I'm doing physical therapy every single day. I don't always do it with a therapist. I see my therapist about once a week now.
What do you feel like is motivating you to do that?
First, I guess the first goal was just not going to a nursing home and get home to see my kids and live back in my house again. I think you just have to stay optimistic and focus on little victories. So I had one day where I was in the hospital and I was completely debilitated. I had, splints on all 4 extremities, and I wanted to open a soda can, like a ginger ale can that they had brought me. Couldn't do it. I couldn't make my fingers work to open a soda can. And, it was pretty crushing to know that I couldn't open a soda can by myself, and I had to ask my wife to open a soda can for me. Well, the next day they brought me a soda can and I opened it. And so it's a small thing, but it's a metric that is objective. So, hey, look, yesterday I couldn't open a soda can, today I can. Yesterday I stood up for 5 seconds, today I stood up for 10 seconds. So I think trying to focus on the small victories and not get overwhelmed by the bigger picture is really important, at least for me too.
Now you did compete in a kayak race already.
Yeah.
Less than 4 months from the injury.
4 months to the day.
4 months today. Okay. So
14.
And so how did the race go?
I won. It was a pretty powerful moment for me. I went there with no aspirations at all. I had no expectations I'd done well in that race in the past. I've won it a couple times, but my only plan was to finish, basically. And I didn't care if I finished last. I would be fine with that, just to be there. I thought it was pretty cool to be out there 4 months to the day after this massive trauma that I experienced. And I'd spent the better part of the spring kind of rehabbing on the Nolichucky. So I was going over there about once a week. So I knew that the whitewater was, not going to be a problem. And then, they said go, and we all took off. It's a mass start. There was maybe 35 people there, something like that. And I came out in front, and I was like, my initial thought was like, well, this is cool and novel, but this is not going to last. And man, I just I was able to maintain through the initial whitewater section. As we got down into the flatter stretches, it kind of occurred to me that as much as something like a kayak race hurts, like it's painful to paddle that hard for that long, it is really pales in comparison to the pain that I have been experiencing for the last 4 months of my life. And you just can't hurt me. And so I just turned it up, and I kept turning it up, and I duked it out with a couple guys for a few miles. And then we came in the home stretch, and when we finished, I was in tears, like literally just kind of like the last few months of struggle and strife and pain and all the stress I put my family through with the accident really came crashing down on me. It was just like this huge cathartic release. It was really pretty Hollywood moment. And it was cool. I had some close friends that have been very instrumental in helping me rehab were there. And I mean, I was just bawling. Yeah, it was wild. One thing I really wanted to mention on the show is that I would not be where I am today without this incredible support system. And that's probably the most important thing, is to have people around you that are able and willing to help you. Mine starts, of course, with my family. My wife has been incredible throughout this process, as well as my kids. But also the whitewater community was really amazing. Like, I had people coming by the hospital almost every day, probably every day, calling, texting, checking up on me. And I wondered if that would kind of fizzle out once I got home. But I had people picking my kids up, bringing them home from school for me, taking me out to get my hair cut or whatever it was, taking me to the river eventually. And so having support is huge.
So that, my friends, is a year in the life of the legendary Adam Herzog. He is on an absolute tear right now. Let's all try to keep up. His next endeavor is kayak instruction and high-end kayak coaching through NOLI, the Nolichucky Outdoor Leadership Institute. If you want to learn from one of the best, look him up. I'll have a link on our Facebook site. I'll also have a link to his article for the American Alpine Club. You can read a more in-depth description of his view of the accident's causes and the lessons he learned from it. It's worth noting that this scenario is not as unusual as it may seem. There are multiple online reports of similar auto belay accidents in climbing gyms around the country, with several fatalities. As Adam mentions in his article, factors such as inattention, or the opposite, too much focus on the difficult moves in the climbing route, deviation from routine, and lack of redundancy in the system all seem to play a role in these situations. And while Adam acknowledges and accepts his personal responsibility here, I think there could be an opportunity for some systematic improvements to help prevent these. As we can see from Adam's preparation for the Stikine, he has a methodical and conscientious approach to his outdoor pursuits. If an accident like this can happen to him, it can happen to any of us. Similar complacency in the whitewater environment has and will lead to serious injuries and fatalities. Not taking a moment to scout a blind corner on a familiar run, misjudging a rising water level, or taking the wrong boat for the wrong conditions are some ways this can play out on the river. Sometimes you need to slow down and force a more vigilant and careful approach to situations. The other important lesson here is injury recovery. Adam is providing a solid model of this. It seems that injury recovery starts well before an accident occurs. First, by maintaining a strong baseline physical fitness, you'll be much more resilient. Second, voluntary and controlled mental and physical suffering in endurance events can prepare you to better deal with real adversity. I think it's interesting that Adam found out that the converse is also true. His suffering from his injury helped him to dig deeper in the suffering aspect of a long-distance kayaking race, a race he ultimately won. And finally, as in almost all other parts of life, a positive attitude and motivation are maybe the most important factors in getting back out on the river after a major injury. Let's all wish Adam a fast recovery and smooth lines as he navigates his way back. That's it for this edition of The Safety Break. Keep sending me your rescue stories, and I hope to see you on the river. Thank you for listening to The Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button and click follow on our Facebook page so we know that you're out there. I'm also looking for more stories. If you know of an interesting non-fatal river accident or rescue, send me a few details by email, safetybreak@gmail.com. It doesn't have to be dramatic or life-threatening, just something that we all might be able to learn from. I'll see if we can turn it into an episode. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the river.